The wind blew dry dust across the valley that day, the kind that stings the eyes and carries the smell of something burning, out there in the far reaches of the Arizona frontier. Miles away from any law or mercy, a ranch once stood, strong, proud and alive with laughter. Its owner, Thomas Redding, was a man known for his calm spirit and iron hands. He'd come west after the war to start a new life, leaving behind the ashes of everything he'd fought for. He built his home from cedar logs, carved with his own knife, nailed with his own hands, and loved by one woman, Anna, his wife who came from the east with nothing but a dream, and a piano she insisted on bringing, through the desert. That ranch was more than timber and dirt. It was their hope, their piece of peace carved from a savage land. But peace doesn't last long. Out there where the coyotes sing on a dry afternoon, when Thomas had gone down to the river to mend a fence, smoke rose on the horizon. At first he thought lightning had struck, the kind that sets brush on fire. But when he saw the shape of the smoke, twisting black against the blue sky, his blood froze. It came from the ridge, his ridge. He dropped his tools and ran, the weight of dread in his chest heavier than his rifle. Every step up that hill was a battle against what he feared most. And when he reached the clearing, the world he built had been swallowed by fire. The house was gone, flames licking through the frame like the devil's tongue. The corral was open, the horses gone, and there in the yard lay the piano, and broken, charred, silent. He screamed her name, Anna, again and again, but the only answer was the crackle of burning wood and the echo of a crow. He searched through the wreckage, his hands bleeding as he threw aside burning boards, until he found the locket he'd given her, still warm from the heat, still carrying her scent of rose water. No body, no sign of her, only tracks. Horse tracks, many of them, leading south into the canyon country. He knew who had done it. He'd heard of the raiders, half renegades, half mercenaries, men who hunted women as trophies and sold them across the border. They were worse than any Apache or outlaw, and he knew what that meant. Anna was alive but taken. He sat there till the fire burned down to embers, his face blackened, his heart hollow. When the night came, he didn't light a fire. He just watched the stars and thought of her, her laugh, her touch, the way she played that piano on Sundays. Then quietly, he made a promise to the wind, to the stars, to God himself, that he would bring her back no matter what it cost. The next morning he went to the town of Dry Creek, where men spoke more with guns than words. He walked into the saloon, covered in soot and blood, and said to the room, "They took my wife." The gamblers stopped their cards. The bartender froze mid-glass. "Anyone who helps me find her," he said, "gets half my land." No one moved. They'd all heard of the men he was talking about, the butcher's gang, killers without a cause, ghosts in the desert. The sheriff just looked away. No one wanted that kind of war. So Thomas turned and left. But there was one man who followed him outside, old Gray Fox, an Apache scout who once rode with the army but left when he saw what white men did to his people. Gray Fox looked at him and said, "You go after them alone. You die before the sun sets," Thomas said. "Then I'll die trying." The old scout studied him for a long while, and finally said, "Maybe it's time the desert remembers who still walks it." Gray Fox rode off that night, and 2 days later, Thomas woke to see shadows moving along the ridges, 50 at first, then 100, then more. Apache warriors, painted and armed, rode silently down the valley. At their front was Gray Fox. Behind him, another figure emerged, a young war chief known as Nantan, whose father had died in the wars against the white soldiers. He owed Thomas a debt. Once, Thomas had saved his sister from a firing squad. Now that debt was being paid in full. Nantan spoke few words, but when he did, they were fire. "We ride for blood, not gold. But your fight is ours." Thomas nodded, not as a master but as a brother. And so it began, a war not of nations but of vengeance. For a week they tracked the butcher's gang through canyon and desert. The Apaches moved like shadows, silent, unseen. Thomas rode among them, his rifle across his saddle, his heart beating like war drums. He slept little, ate less, and dreamed of her face. Each sunrise brought him closer, and each day the fury in his chest grew darker. One night as they camped near the Devil's Backbone, Gray Fox came to him. "When we find them," the scout said, "you must choose. Revenge or life. Sometimes they cannot be both." Thomas stared into the fire and said, "I just want her back." Gray Fox nodded, but his eyes said he knew better. When dawn broke, they found the gang, hidden in an abandoned mining camp, drunk and loud, their campfires lighting the canyon walls. Thomas counted 30 of them. He looked around. 500 Apache warriors waited in the shadows, silent as stone. The signal was simple, one hawk's cry. When it came, the desert exploded. Arrows flew like rain. Horses screamed. The butcher's men reached for guns, but death was faster. Smoke filled the canyon. Thomas rode straight through the fire, his rifle blazing, his mind blind with rage. He saw faces, flashes, blood, but he only looked for one thing: her. At the far end of the camp, in a tent made of stolen cloth, he found her. She was tied, bruised, but alive. When she saw him, her eyes widened, not in fear, but in disbelief. He fell to his knees beside her, cut her free, and for a long moment neither spoke. The world around them burned and screamed. But in that tent, time stopped. She touched his face, trembling. "You came," she whispered. He said nothing, just held her, the firelight dancing across their faces. Outside, the last of the raiders fell silent. The desert went quiet again, except for the crackling of dying flames. When they returned to the valley, his house was gone, but the land was still there, and so was she. Together they built again, stronger than before. The Apache rode back to their mountains, leaving behind no trace but the memory of a night when justice came from the hills like thunder. Years later, when their children asked him about the scars on his hands, Thomas would just look toward the horizon and say, "The desert takes what it wants, but sometimes, if you're willing to bleed for it, it gives something back." The dawn after the battle came slow and heavy, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise upon what had been done. Smoke still lingered in the canyon, hanging low like a memory that refused to fade. Thomas Redding stood by the ashes of the raiders' camp, his wife wrapped in a blanket beside him, her eyes distant and quiet. Around them, the Apache warriors moved like ghosts, tending to the wounded and gathering their fallen. The wind carried no sound but the crackle of cooling embers and the soft chant of a morning song, a melody old as the desert itself. Thomas had found her, but what he'd lost could never be measured in timber or gold. As the light crept over the red cliffs, he looked upon the men who had ridden with him, warriors who owed him nothing yet followed him into fire. Nantan, the young Apache chief, stood at the ridge, his face streaked with paint and blood. "It is done," Nantan said. "Your woman is safe. The bad men are gone." Thomas nodded, but his heart felt heavier than before. "No," he said quietly, "it's never done." They rode back slowly through the desert, the same trail where death had stalked them days before. The Apache rode in silence, their horses tired but proud. Thomas kept close to Anna, who said little, only glancing at him now and then, as if afraid he might vanish with the dawn. When they reached the valley where his ranch once stood, he stopped and stared. The land was empty, blackened earth, broken fences, the bones of his home scattered like memories. Anna took his hand. "We can rebuild," she whispered. But her voice trembled, for she saw the faraway look in his eyes, the one men carried when they'd seen too much. That night they camped beside the ashes of their past. Thomas watched the Apache make fire in a circle, their chants rising into the night sky. Gray Fox sat beside him, his old hand steady as he sharpened a blade. "You got her back," he said. "Now what will you do with the man that's left?" Thomas didn't answer. He stared into the flames, seeing faces in the smoke. The men he'd killed, the ones who begged, the ones who didn't have time to. He remembered the first time he'd killed a man, back in the war, and how he'd sworn never to do it again. But some promises he now knew burn easier than wood. As the firelight flickered, Anna came to sit beside him. "They'll come," she said softly. "The soldiers. They'll come for you and for them." She was right. Word would spread that a white man had ridden with 500 Apache warriors, that they'd slaughtered a gang of raiders the army once called informants. The frontier had no patience for men who blurred its lines. Thomas had crossed from rancher to outlaw in a single night. Days passed. Together they rebuilt a small cabin, and not like the first one, grand and hopeful but humble quiet. The Apaches helped, silent and swift, and when it was done, Nantan came to him. "We return to the mountains," he said. "But you must be ready. The Bluecoats will not forgive this." Thomas nodded. "If they come, they'll find I've learned a thing or two from the desert." For a while, peace held. Anna healed slowly. Her laughter came back like a spring creek, faint but alive. Thomas tilled the soil again, planted corn and hope in the same ground that once burned. But in the distance, riders began to appear, the scouts, soldiers, shadows. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, dust rose on the ridge. Anna came running. "Tom," she cried, "they're coming." He looked up, a column of cavalry, their flags glinting in the dying light. The army had come. He saddled his horse and met them halfway alone. The officer who rode ahead wore a blue coat trimmed in gold, his face cold and polished. "Thomas Redding," he said, "by order of Fort Bowie Command, you are under arrest for collusion with hostile natives in the murder of 37 men. Thomas met his gaze. "Those men murdered my wife and burned my home." The officer smirked. "And you brought the devil himself to their doorstep. We'll see how the judge feels about that." Before Thomas could answer, a cry echoed through the valley, the sound of a horn that wasn't theirs. From the hills, shadows began to move, Apache riders, dozens, then hundreds, appearing like ghosts from the rocks. The officer froze. "What is this?" he barked. Thomas turned, his eyes calm. "You didn't come to talk. You came to finish what others started." The cavalry drew their rifles. The Apaches raised their spears. The valley held its breath. Then Gray Fox's voice rang out from the ridge. "No more blood!" he shouted in both tongues. "Enough ghosts walk this land." The officer hesitated, unsure. Nantan rode forward, his war paint streaked but his hands empty. "We do not want war," he said. "The man you hunt is not your enemy. He fought for his heart, not for blood." Thomas looked between them, his chest heavy with the weight of it all. He could have ordered the charge. He could have lit the desert on fire again. But then he looked at Anna standing by their cabin, her hands trembling, her eyes begging him not to. He dropped his rifle. "I'm done fighting," he said. The officer sneered. "Then surrender." Thomas stepped forward slowly, hands open. "I'll go," he said. "But you—" "I'll leave them out of it." The soldiers bound him, and Anna screamed. But he turned to her and said softly, "It's all right. Some debts I can't repay with bullets." The Apaches watched as the soldiers rode off with him. Nantan raised his hand in salute. "You are one of us now," he said. "No matter what they call you." They took him to Fort Bowie, where he was chained, questioned, and called traitor. But something strange happened. The soldiers who'd heard the yell. Story began to whisper of the man who rode with 500 Apaches, who burned down evil and brought his wife back from hell. Soon the officers stopped calling him outlaw and started calling him legend. Months passed before he was released, pardoned by a commander who said, "The frontier needs men like you more than it needs rules." When he returned home, Anna was waiting by the same river where it had all begun. She ran to him, and for the first time in a long while he smiled. The Apache had long returned to their mountains, but their memory lingered like the wind, unseen, eternal. They rebuilt again together, this time slower and wiser. The piano was gone, but Anna sang to the land, and Thomas listened. Sometimes when the wind blew through the valley at night, it carried faint drums and chants, the voices of those who rode with him, who made the desert remember. Years later, when strangers passed through that valley and asked about the ruins on the ridge, the locals would say, "That's where a man's love started a war. That's where the Apaches rode for one of their own." And if you ever stand in that valley when the moon is high, you might hear hooves in the distance, not of soldiers, but of warriors riding once more through time, carrying the story of Thomas Redding and the fire that refused to die.